300 men gathered together to attack a camp of thousands. They broke up into 3 groups, 100 in each. They were enormously outnumbered. If you looked at the battle on paper, you'd think it was a joke or another spin-off of the Battle of Thermopylae. But this wasn't a showdown between Spartans and Persians. This was a showdown between 300 Israelites, led by Gideon, against thousands of Midianites. Let's just say King Leonidas and his Spartans have got nothing on Gideon and his crew. But before we get to the blood, let's rewind. The Israelites were worshiping false gods after the death of Deborah. And during this time, they were handed over by God to the Midianites as punishment. In the midst of the Midianites oppressing the Israelites, God sends an angel to appear to Gideon. This angel is used by God to speak to Gideon. God tells him, "Go in the strength you have and deliver Israel from the grasp of Midian. I am sending you." Judges 6:14. And it is here that we see the apprehension rise up in Gideon. It didn't matter how much reassurance God provided for him. Gideon wanted a sign. And then when he got the sign, he was taken aback. He was surprised. So God decided to give Gideon a small task in comparison to what he ultimately wanted him to do. God told him to tear down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father and cut down the Asherah pole beside it and replace them with an altar to the Lord. Judges 6:25b through 26. Notice the owner of these tools of idolatry, they were his father's. So Gideon agrees, but he is so afraid that he does so in the middle of the night so that he doesn't get caught by his family or the people of the city. It's clear already that Gideon is a mighty and courageous warrior. Not at all. Gideon reminds us of a child who is unsure of a new situation, who is uneasy with what lies before him. And yet, God doesn't strike him down for his timidity, but it seems that God is guiding Gideon to true dependency. Gideon does what God told him to do. He tore down his father's tools of idolatry. He took a step forward. He obeyed God. Shortly thereafter, the Spirit of the Lord enveloped Gideon, and he sent messengers to the people of the region, and soon enough, Gideon had thousands around him. He was set to do what God called him to do. But again, Gideon wants a sign before he moves forward. "I will put a wool fleece here on the threshing floor. If dew is only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, I will know that you will deliver Israel by my strength, as you said." Judges 6:37. Sure enough, the next morning the fleece is wet and the ground is dry. Finally, Gideon had the confidence he needed to move forward and do what God called him to do. But no, Gideon wanted more assurance. "Please allow me to make one more test with the fleece. Let it remain dry and the dew be all over the ground." Judges 6:39b. That night, God showed Gideon a dry fleece and a wet ground. What else would Gideon ask to see? The next morning, Gideon had seen enough signs. He was ready, finally, to do what God called him to do. I can hear the crowd going wild. Can you? 32,000 soldiers gathered to Gideon, ready to do battle. But God had some parameters of his own in mind. "You have too many troops for me to hand the Midianites over to them, or else Israel might elevate themselves over me and say, 'My own strength saved me.'" Judges 7:2. So Gideon does what God tells him to do and gives any trembling and fearful soldiers a way out of the battle. 22,000 go home and 10,000 remain. But that wasn't enough subtraction for God. "There are still too many troops," the Lord said to Gideon. And with that, the troops went down to the water, where God handpicked 300 soldiers to go into battle. From 32,000 to 300, God was ready to send Gideon into battle. That night, the 300 men were divided into 3 companies. Armed with a trumpet and a pitcher with a torch in it, the Israelites made their move. They surrounded the Midianite camp, broke their pitchers, blew their trumpets, and declared, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Judges 7:20. Chaos began to ensue in the Midianite camp. They thought they were being overrun by thousands. They began turning on each other and fleeing their camp. The 300 pursued the Midianites with their focus on capturing their kings. From one town to the next, the pursuit continued. Finally, in the town of Karkor, the 300 caught up to the 15,000 Midianites and their kings. The kings were captured, their armies routed. Gideon liberated Israel from the grasp of the Midianites by killing their kings. The Israelites enjoyed 40 years of peace under the leadership of Gideon, but it didn't come easy and it didn't come quickly. Gideon shows us what an insecure and apprehensive person can do when they finally give up control and give it to the King of Kings. Gideon shows us just how patient God is with us. I mean, let's be honest, if you or I were God, we would have smited Gideon after the third request for a sign. Just do it already. But above all, what God did with and in Gideon should be an encouragement for us. God comes to us and calls us out of the bondage we are in, like a loving father rescues his son or daughter. He is patient, he is kind, he is ready to be trusted. And many of us are like Gideon. We are insecure, we are timid, we are apprehensive to stepping into the things God is calling us to. But that doesn't need to be a source of shame. Jesus took our insecurities, our timidness, and our apprehension with him to the cross. He nailed it down so it wouldn't have its power over us anymore. He nailed it down so that we could experience what true life is, so that we could receive the spirit of power, not of fear. Because of Christ, we can walk confidently today, not for any reason that stems from our own being, but for the reason that God, who is rich in mercy and limitless in power, has decided to indwell his children. He was patient with Gideon, and he is patient with you and me. But we must never forget that he is calling out to us and inviting us to step into his ways and his plans. So friend, let us look around at the tangible. Let us breathe in the invisible. Let us see and feel all that is as a sufficient sign that we can trust him.